My wife demanded my $5 million inheritance, but I refused. During my business trip, she called and said, "I demolished your parents' home. Now they will live in a shelter." I couldn't help but laugh. Because the house was, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Desmond, and at 54 years old, I thought I knew my wife completely. 8 years of marriage had taught me her rhythms, her moods, her little habits that once seemed endearing. But as I sat in that sterile hotel room in Chicago, staring at my phone after the call ended, I realized I had been living with a stranger. The phone had rung at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm, the kind of tedious work that pays the bills but numbs the soul. When I saw Lisa's name on the screen, I smiled. Despite everything that had been happening between us lately, I still felt that familiar warmth when she called. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, setting down my pen and leaning back in the uncomfortable desk chair. "Desmond!" Her voice was different, sharp, triumphant in a way that made my stomach clench. "I have something to tell you." I waited, listening to her breathing on the other end. There was something theatrical about her pause, like she was savoring a moment she had been planning for weeks. "I demolished your parents' house." The words hung in the air between us. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "What did you say?" "You heard me correctly. I hired a demolition crew this morning. Your parents' precious little house on Maple Street is gone, completely gone, nothing but rubble and dust." My grip tightened on the phone. Through the hotel window, Chicago sprawled endlessly below me, but suddenly the room felt impossibly small. "Lisa, what are you talking about?" Her laugh was cold, mechanical. "Oh, don't pretend to be shocked, Desmond. You've been dragging your feet on this for 3 years. 3 years since they died, and you still wouldn't sell that worthless property. Well, now you don't have a choice." I could picture her pacing around our kitchen, probably wearing one of her expensive outfits, the ones that cost more than my parents spent on clothes in an entire year. She always paced when she was excited about something, when she thought she had won some invisible battle. "Where are they supposed to live now?" I asked quietly. "Who? Your parents?" "Desmond, they're dead. They've been dead for 3 years. The house was just sitting there, rotting, while you held on to some sentimental nonsense about preserving their memory." "I meant the tenants, Lisa. The elderly couple who've been renting the place." Another laugh, sharper this time. "Oh, them. I gave them 24 hours notice yesterday. They can figure it out. Maybe there's a shelter somewhere. The important thing is that now you'll finally have to use that inheritance money properly." And that's when I started laughing. It began as a quiet chuckle, barely audible, but it grew into something deeper, more genuine than any laugh I'd had in months. Lisa's voice became shrill on the other end, demanding to know what was so funny, but I couldn't stop. The absurdity of it all, the perfect irony of what she had just done, hit me like a revelation. "Desmond, stop laughing and listen to me. Do you understand what this means? Now we can finally access that money. We can buy a proper house, somewhere with real value. We can live the way we deserve to live." I wiped my eyes, still chuckling. "Oh, Lisa, if only you knew." "Knew what? Stop being cryptic and get serious about this. I've solved our problem. The house was worthless anyway, just a burden holding us back." That's when the memories started flooding back. Not just of the house, but of how we got here. How I had been so blind to what she really was, so desperate to believe in the fairy tale of our love story that I ignored every red flag she waved in front of me. I met Lisa 8 years ago at a charity auction. She was bidding on a weekend at a luxury spa, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When she lost the bid to another woman, I watched her face carefully. Most people would have been disappointed but gracious. Lisa's expression darkened with something uglier. Resentment. Entitlement. I should have paid attention to that moment. Instead, I was captivated by her beauty, her confidence, the way she moved through the room like she owned it. When I introduced myself and offered to buy her a drink, her entire demeanor shifted. She became warm, charming, attentive. Later, I learned she had done her research, knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. Our courtship was a masterpiece of manipulation, though I was too smitten to recognize it at the time. She laughed at all my jokes, shared my interests with suspicious enthusiasm, and gradually began suggesting little improvements to my life. My apartment was too small, my car too modest, my wardrobe too casual. Each criticism was wrapped in concern for my success, my image, my happiness. The first time I brought her to meet my parents, I should have seen the signs then, too. Mom had made her famous pot roast, the same recipe she'd used for 30 years. Dad wore his good shirt, the one he saved for church and special occasions. Their little house on Maple Street was spotless, filled with the scent of fresh flowers Mom had cut from her garden. Lisa smiled and complimented everything, but I caught the subtle way she avoided touching surfaces, how she declined to sit on Dad's worn leather recliner, how she pushed the food around her plate without really eating. After we left, she was quiet for most of the drive home. "They're sweet," she finally said, but the word came out flat, like she was describing a piece of stale cake. "They loved you," I told her, and they had. Mom had pulled me aside in the kitchen to whisper how beautiful Lisa was, how lucky I was to find such an elegant woman. "The house is very quaint," Lisa continued, staring out the passenger window. "Very old-fashioned." I should have defended them then. Should have told her about how Dad had worked double shifts at the factory to pay off that house, how Mom had sewed curtains for every window with her own hands, how every piece of furniture held a story, a memory, a piece of their life together. Instead, I made excuses. "They've lived there for 40 years. It's home to them." "Of course," Lisa said quickly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I didn't mean anything negative. It's just different from what I'm used to." That was her gift, I realize now. She could plant seeds of doubt, criticism, dissatisfaction, and then immediately smooth them over with affection. She made me complicit in my own disappointment with the people I loved most. Over the next few months, as our relationship deepened, she began making casual comments about my parents' house. Wouldn't they be more comfortable somewhere modern with better heating and air conditioning? Wasn't I worried about the neighborhood changing? Wouldn't the property be worth more if we sold it while the market was good? "I'm just thinking about their future," she would say, "and yours. When they're gone, that house will just be a burden. Old houses require so much maintenance." When I proposed to her, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. Lisa was everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner. Beautiful, sophisticated, ambitious. She pushed me to be better, to want more, to reach higher. I convinced myself that her suggestions about my parents came from love, from wanting the best for our future family. We married in 2017, a lavish ceremony that Lisa planned down to the smallest detail. Everything had to be perfect. From the imported flowers to the designer dress to the venue that cost more than my parents had spent on their entire wedding. When Dad offered to contribute to the expenses, Lisa gracefully declined. But I saw the way she looked at his worn wallet, the judgment in her eyes. The first real crack in our marriage appeared when my parents got sick. Dad's heart started failing first, and Mom's arthritis made it difficult for her to care for him. Lisa suggested we hire help, but when she learned how much it would cost, she had a different idea. "There are excellent care facilities," she said, showing me glossy brochures. "Professional staff, medical care on site, activities designed for seniors. It would be so much better for them." "They want to stay in their own home," I told her. "It's where they've been happy for 40 years. "Desmond, be realistic. That house isn't equipped for elderly care. No grab bars in the bathroom, stairs to navigate, no emergency response system. What if something happens when you're not there?" She was logical, practical, seemingly concerned for their welfare, but I knew my parents. They had told me repeatedly that they wanted to live out their days surrounded by their memories, their garden, their neighbors who had become family over the decades. When they died within 6 months of each other in 2021, Lisa's mask slipped just a little. At the funeral, while I stood hollow-eyed and grieving, she was already talking about estate planning, about the wisdom of selling the house quickly before the market changed. "I know this is hard," she said that night as I sat staring at the photo albums Mom had kept so carefully. "But holding on to the past won't bring them back. The best way to honor them is to move forward, to build something meaningful with what they left you." What they left me was $200,000 from their life insurance and retirement savings, plus the house they had finally paid off just 5 years before they died. To Lisa, it was a windfall we could use to upgrade our lifestyle. To me, it was all that remained of two people who had loved me unconditionally. Now, sitting in this hotel room, listening to her describe the destruction of everything I had left of them, I finally understood what I had been too blind to see for 8 years. "Desmond, are you listening to me?" Lisa's voice cut through my thoughts. "We need to talk about how we're going to invest this money. I've been looking at houses in Westfield Heights, real estate with actual value." I looked out at the Chicago skyline, at the lives unfolding in thousands of windows, and felt something settle inside me. Peace, maybe. Or clarity. "We'll talk when I get home," I said quietly. "Good. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable about this. I know change is hard, but sometimes you have to be willing to let go of things that aren't serving your future." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my hotel room for a long time. Lisa thought she had won something today. She thought she had finally forced my hand, eliminated the last obstacle between her and the money she had been coveting for 3 years. If only she knew what she had actually done. If only she knew that the house she had just demolished wasn't the only secret I had been keeping. The flight home from Chicago gave me 6 hours to remember everything I had tried to forget about the last 3 years. As the plane cut through clouds above America's heartland, I found myself thinking about the day my parents died, and more importantly, what happened in the weeks that followed. Lisa had been so helpful during those dark days. Too helpful, I realized now. While I was barely functional with grief, she took charge of everything with an efficiency that should have alarmed me. She organized the funeral, contacted the insurance companies, and had already scheduled 3 real estate appointments before Mom and Dad were even in the ground. "I know this feels overwhelming," she had said, rubbing my shoulders as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. "But taking care of these practical matters now will save us so much stress later. Your parents would want you to handle their affairs responsibly." The first realtor she brought to the house was a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who walked through my childhood home like she was calculating board feet of lumber. I followed behind them, watching this stranger evaluate the place where I had taken my first steps, learned to ride a bike, brought home report cards and prom dates and college acceptance letters. "The bones are good," Patricia said, running her hand along the living room wall. "But obviously it needs complete updating. New kitchen, new bathrooms, hardwood floors refinished. The electrical probably needs to be brought up to code." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "How much do you think we could get for it as is?" "As is? Maybe 120,000, 130 at the most. The lot is decent sized, but the location isn't prime. Most buyers in this price range will want something move-in ready." I watched Lisa's face fall slightly. She had been hoping for more, I could tell. After Patricia left, she spent the evening on her laptop, pulling up comparable sales in the neighborhood, calculating renovation costs, sketching out budget scenarios on legal pads. "If we put about 50,000 into updates, we could probably get 180,000, she announced over dinner. "That's a pretty good return on investment." "Or we could keep it," I said quietly. "Rent it out. The mortgage is paid off." Lisa set down her fork and looked at me with the patient expression she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Desmond, be honest with yourself. Do you really want to be a landlord? Dealing with tenants, maintenance calls, property taxes, and for what? Maybe $800 a month in rental income, assuming we can keep it occupied?" She pulled out her phone and started showing me rental listings in the area. "Look at this place. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, just like your parents' house. $750 a month, and it's been on the market for 6 weeks. The numbers made sense. Lisa always made sure the numbers made sense. But something in my chest tightened every time I imagined strangers living in my parents' bedroom, children who weren't me playing in the backyard where Dad had taught me to throw a baseball. I need more time to think about it, I told her. Lisa's smile was understanding, supportive. Of course, sweetheart. This is a big decision. Take all the time you need. But she didn't really mean it. Over the next few weeks, she brought up the subject regularly, always with new arguments, new reasons why selling was the smart choice. The house was too old, too small, in a declining neighborhood. Property taxes were going up. The roof would need replacement soon. The furnace was ancient. She scheduled more real estate appointments, each one presented as just getting information, just understanding our options. But I noticed how she lingered over the purchase agreements, how she asked detailed questions about closing costs and timelines. "I found the most amazing house yesterday," she said one evening, spreading photographs across the dining room table. "It's in Westfield Heights, that new development near the country club. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, gourmet kitchen, finished basement." The house in the photos looked like something from a magazine. All clean lines and expensive fixtures, with a 3-car garage and professionally landscaped yard. It was beautiful in the way that model homes are beautiful, perfect and soulless. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. $450,000. "But Desmond, think about it. This is an investment in our future. Property values in Westfield Heights have increased 18% in the last 2 years. We could build real wealth here." I did the math in my head. Even if we sold my parents' house for the optimistic $180,000 plus the $200,000 from their life insurance and savings, we'd still need to finance almost half the purchase price. Our monthly payments would triple. "We can afford it," Lisa said, watching my expression. "Your consulting business is doing well, and I've been thinking about going back to work. Part-time, maybe something in interior design." Lisa had worked briefly as a design assistant before we got married, but she'd quit after 6 months, claiming the hours were too demanding and the pay too low for someone with her aesthetic sense. In the 3 years since my parents died, her part-time job intentions had never materialized into actual employment. "Let's just see what happens with Mom and Dad's place first," I said. "No rush." But Lisa was getting impatient. I could see it in the way she talked about the house, the increasing edge in her voice when she described the maintenance issues, the subtle criticisms of my reluctance to move forward. "I drove by there yesterday," she announced one evening in late October. "The yard looks terrible. All those leaves and nobody's raking them. It's bringing down the whole neighborhood. I'll go over this weekend and clean it up." "Desmond, you're missing the point. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The house is becoming a burden. You're working 60 hours a week trying to build your business, and now you're spending weekends doing yard work on a property that's just sitting empty." She was right, of course. She was always right about the practical details, but she was also wrong about everything that mattered. That weekend, I drove to Maple Street and spent the day raking leaves in my parents' yard. The house sat silent behind me, windows dark, the flower boxes Mom had tended so carefully now filled with the brown stalks of plants killed by frost. It felt like visiting a grave. But as I worked, neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought me a thermos of hot coffee. The Hernandez family asked if I was planning to rent the place out, mentioned that their nephew was looking for somewhere to live. Tom Morrison, the retired mechanic who lived across the street, offered to keep an eye on the property during the winter. These people had been my parents' friends for decades. They had watched me grow up, celebrated my graduation, attended my wedding. They still asked about my parents with genuine affection, shared stories about Dad helping them fix their cars and Mom bringing casseroles when someone was sick. Standing in that familiar yard, surrounded by these familiar faces, I made a decision. I called Lisa that afternoon and told her I wanted to rent the house out after all. She was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure about this?" she asked finally. "It seems like you're letting emotions cloud your judgment." "Maybe," I admitted, "but it's my decision to make." Within a week, I had found tenants. An elderly couple named Robert and Margaret who had been priced out of their previous apartment when their building went condo. They loved the house immediately, loved the neighborhood, loved the fact that it had character and history instead of granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Lisa smiled and said all the right things about giving it a try, about seeing how being a landlord worked out. But I caught the look in her eyes, the disappointment she tried to hide. For the next 2 years, the rental arrangement worked perfectly. Robert and Margaret were ideal tenants. Respectful, responsible, quiet. They paid their $800 rent on time every month, took care of small maintenance issues themselves, and treated the house like it was their own, because in many ways, it was. But Lisa never stopped pushing. Every few months she would bring up the subject again. Property values were rising. The rental income wasn't keeping up with inflation. We were missing opportunities to build wealth. "I understand you want to honor your parents' memory," she said during one particularly intense conversation. "But don't you think they would want you to make smart financial decisions? They worked their whole lives to leave you something valuable. Letting it just sit there generating minimal income isn't honoring their sacrifice." She had a gift for making me feel guilty about my own sentimentality, for framing her ambitions as concern for my well-being or respect for my parents' wishes. But I held firm, and eventually she seemed to accept that I wasn't going to change my mind. Until this morning, when she decided to take matters into her own hands. What Lisa didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 6 months ago I had made a different kind of decision. Not about the house, but about our marriage, about her, about the future she was so desperately trying to control. I had begun to see through the careful facade she maintained, the way she manipulated conversations to always end up where she wanted them. I noticed how she talked about money, about status, about the life she felt entitled to live. I saw how she looked at our friends' houses, their cars, their vacations, always calculating, always comparing. And I started to plan. The house on Maple Street that Lisa had demolished this morning wasn't the only property I owned. It wasn't even the most valuable one. 3 years ago, while she was busy pressuring me to sell my parents' house, I had been quietly investigating something else entirely. Mom and Dad's property on Maple Street sat on almost 2 acres of land. Most of it was behind the house, hidden by old oak trees and overgrown hedges. To Lisa, to the realtors, to anyone who just looked at the house from the street, it appeared to be a modest lot in a working-class neighborhood. But I remembered something from my childhood, something I had never mentioned to Lisa. I remembered Dad talking about the land surveys from the 1980s, about how the city had approached him about purchasing the back portion of the property for a new municipal building. Dad had turned them down because he didn't want the disruption, but he had kept the survey documents in his file cabinet. After the funeral, while Lisa was busy planning our financial future, I spent an afternoon going through Dad's old papers. The survey was still there, along with correspondence from the city and a private development company that had also shown interest in the land. I made some quiet phone calls, had lunch with a few people, drove out to look at comparable properties that had sold recently. What I discovered changed everything. The back acre and a half of my parents' property was worth $5 million. As the plane began its descent into our home airport, I smiled for the first time since Lisa's phone call. She thought she had demolished my parents' house to force me into selling the property. She thought she had finally eliminated the obstacle between her and the inheritance money she had been coveting for 3 years. What she had actually done was demolish a worthless replica I had built on the original foundation using materials that cost me less than $50,000. The real house, the one with all my childhood memories, my parents' furniture, Mom's garden, and Dad's workshop, was safe in storage, along with the $5 million I had received when I quietly sold the back portion of the property to developers last year. Lisa wanted to play games with my inheritance. She had no idea what game she was actually playing. The taxi pulled into our driveway at exactly 7:30 in the evening, and I could see Lisa waiting at the window before I even paid the driver. She had that look on her face, the one she wore when she thought she had won something important. Her silhouette moved away from the glass as I walked up the front steps, and by the time I reached the door, she was already opening it. "Welcome home," she said, and there was something different in her voice, a confidence I hadn't heard in months. She was wearing the black dress she saved for special occasions, her hair perfectly styled, makeup freshly applied. She looked like she was celebrating. "Leza." I set my briefcase down in the foyer and loosened my tie, studying her face. "You look nice." "I thought we should discuss our situation properly. Over dinner." She gestured toward the dining room, where I could see she had set the table with our good china, lit candles, even opened what looked like an expensive bottle of wine. "I ordered from that Italian place you like." I followed her into the dining room, noting the care she had taken with the presentation. This was Lisa at her most strategic, using atmosphere and attention to detail to create the mood she wanted. She poured wine into both glasses, her movements deliberate and graceful. "So," she said, settling into her chair with a satisfied smile, "I imagine you've had some time to think about our conversation today." "I have." I took a sip of wine, watching her over the rim of my glass. The Chianti was excellent, probably cost more than Robert and Margaret paid for groceries in a month. "Tell me exactly what you did." Lisa's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I called Morrison Brothers Demolition first thing this morning. They had a crew available, and I told them it was an emergency situation. The house was structurally unsound, needed to come down immediately for safety reasons." "And they believed that?" She waved a dismissive hand. "I can be very persuasive when necessary. I also may have mentioned that we were the property owners and had already cleared it with the city. They were there by 10 o'clock. I set down my wine glass and leaned back in my chair. "You lied to a demolition crew to tear down a house you don't own." "Desmond, we are married. Community property laws mean I have as much right to make decisions about that house as you do." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was explaining basic arithmetic. "Besides, what's done is done. The important thing is that now we can move forward." She reached across the table and pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. Inside were photographs printed from her phone, showing the demolition in progress. I could see the Morrison Brothers truck, 2 workers in hard hats, and the systematic destruction of what Lisa believed was my parents' house. "I documented everything," she said proudly. "I wanted you to see that it was handled professionally. No damage to the surrounding properties, everything cleaned up properly." I studied the photos carefully. The house in them looked exactly like my parents' home from the street view. Same white paint, same blue shutters, same front porch with the swing Dad had built when I was 12. But I knew something Lisa didn't know. What she had demolished was a carefully constructed replica I had commissioned 18 months ago. The idea had come to me gradually as I watched Lisa's frustration with my refusal to sell the property grow more intense. She was becoming increasingly bold in her attempts to force my hand, and I realized I needed to protect what was truly valuable while appearing to give her what she wanted. The real breakthrough came when I discovered the true value of the land. It started with a conversation I had with Tom Morrison, the retired mechanic who lived across the street from my parents. Tom was one of those men who paid attention to everything happening in the neighborhood, and during one of my visits to check on the rental property, he mentioned something interesting. "Lot of fancy cars been driving through lately," he said, leaning against his mailbox as I finished mowing the front yard. "Suits with clipboards, measuring things. Your folks ever mention anything about the city wanting to buy their land?" I paused, thinking back to conversations from my childhood. "Dad mentioned something once about a municipal building, but that was years ago." Tom nodded knowingly. "Well, something's got their interest again. Saw them back there by the old oak trees yesterday, taking pictures and such. That evening I called the city planning office and requested copies of all recent surveys and development proposals for Maple Street. What I found buried in the paperwork made my hands shake. 3 different entities had submitted formal inquiries about purchasing large parcels of land in my parents' neighborhood for development projects. The area was being rezoned from residential to mixed-use commercial. Property values weren't just going up, they were about to skyrocket. But the most shocking discovery came when I hired my own surveyor to examine the exact boundaries of my parents' property. The land extended much further back than I had ever realized. What looked like city-owned woods behind the house was actually part of the original 2-acre parcel my grandfather had purchased in 1947. Over the decades, trees and brush had grown up, making the boundaries invisible, but the legal description was clear. My parents had owned almost 2 full acres in what was about to become the most valuable commercial real estate in the county. I spent the next month quietly researching development companies, zoning laws, and property values. I met with lawyers and real estate specialists, always careful to schedule these appointments when Lisa thought I was handling routine business matters. What I learned was staggering. Conservative estimates put the value of the back acre and a half at somewhere between $4 and $6 million, depending on the final zoning decisions and which development company ultimately won the bidding for municipal contracts. But there was a window of opportunity. The current property owners had 60 days to respond to preliminary purchase offers before the city would move forward with eminent domain proceedings. Most of the elderly residents in the neighborhood had already sold, taking quick cash offers without understanding the true value of what they were giving up. I had a choice to make. I could tell Lisa about the discovery and let her push me into a quick sale that would net us maybe half of what the land was actually worth. Or I could handle this strategically, protect the true value, and see exactly how far she would go in her attempts to control our financial future. I chose the strategic approach. Working with a discreet real estate attorney, I set up a shell company called Heritage Land Holdings. Then I quietly negotiated the sale of the back portion of the property to Westfield Development Group, the company that had won the municipal building contract. The final sale price was $5,200,000. But here's what made it truly brilliant. I only sold the land, not the house. The front portion of the property, where the actual house sat, remained in my name. To anyone looking at public records, it would appear that the original owners had sold off some unused back acreage to developers, nothing more. Lisa never knew any of this happened. To maintain the illusion, I hired a small construction company to build an exact replica of my parents' house on the remaining front portion of the property. Same dimensions, same materials, even the same paint colors. I had them use cheaper construction methods and materials that would look authentic from the outside but wouldn't last more than a few years. Meanwhile, I carefully moved everything valuable from the original house into climate-controlled storage: furniture, photographs, Dad's tools, Mom's china, even the wooden floors and original light fixtures. If I ever wanted to rebuild their home exactly as it had been, I could. The elderly tenants, Robert and Margaret, were relocated to a much nicer apartment across town. I covered their moving expenses and gave them 6 months free rent, telling them I had decided to renovate the property. Lisa never questioned any of this. As far as she knew, I had simply decided to make some improvements to increase the rental value. For 18 months, the replica house sat on Maple Street, looking exactly like my parents' home from the outside. Lisa drove by occasionally, always returning with complaints about how it was dragging down the neighborhood or concerns about the cost of maintenance. She had no idea she was looking at a building that cost me less than $50,000 to construct, sitting on a small lot I had essentially paid for with pocket change from a $5 million sale. Now, as I sat across from her at our dining room table, looking at photos of the demolition she was so proud of, I felt something between amusement and sadness. "The insurance will cover the demolition costs, won't it?" she was asking, pouring herself another glass of wine. I made sure to document everything for the claim. "Lisa," I said quietly, "there is no insurance claim." Her expression shifted slightly, a small frown creasing her forehead. "What do you mean?" "Of course there's insurance. You've been paying premiums for 3 years. The insurance was for the original house. The one that was demolished today was never insured." Now she looked confused, maybe even a little worried. "Desmond, What are you talking about? I saw the house myself. I've driven by it dozens of times. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder of my own. Inside were the real property records, the development contracts, the banking statements showing the $5 million deposit, and photographs of my parents' actual belongings safe in storage. The house you demolished today was built 18 months ago, I said, spreading the documents across the table between us. It was a replica, constructed on the small front portion of the property after I sold the back acre and a half to developers. Lisa stared at the papers, her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. That's impossible. The sale was finalized in June of last year, $5,200,000. The money has been sitting in investment accounts that you don't have access to, earning interest while I decided what to do next. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something harder to read. She set down her wineglass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. You're lying. I pulled out my phone and showed her the banking app, scrolling to the account summary that showed a current balance of $5,743,000. Lisa's skin went pale. This isn't possible. You can't have hidden this from me. We're married. I would have known. You would have known if you had ever asked the right questions, but you were so focused on forcing me to sell what you thought was a worthless house in a declining neighborhood that you never bothered to research the actual value of the land. She grabbed the property documents, scanning them frantically. These could be fake. You could have had these made. I pulled out my phone again and called my attorney's office. David, it's Desmond. I'm going to need you to send verification of the Heritage Land Holdings transaction to my home email address. Yes, the full documentation package. Lisa watched me make the call, her eyes getting wider with each word. When I hung up, she was staring at me like I was a stranger. My laptop is in the study, I said. We can verify everything together. 20 minutes later, Lisa sat in stunned silence as we scrolled through official records, bank statements, and legal documents that confirmed everything I had told her. The sale was real. The money was real. The house she had demolished that morning was nothing but an expensive piece of theater. Why, she whispered finally, why would you hide this from me? I looked at her sitting there in her black dress, surrounded by the candles and expensive wine she had used to set the scene for what she thought would be her victory celebration, and I felt something like pity. Because I needed to see how far you would go, I said. I needed to know who you really are. And now I knew. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The silence in our dining room stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Lisa sat motionless, staring at the laptop screen that displayed our banking information, her face cycling through emotions I had never seen before. The candlelight flickered across her features, creating shadows that made her look like a different person entirely. Finally, she closed the laptop with deliberate slowness and looked up at me. You tested me, she said, and her voice was different now, colder. The warmth and charm that had captivated me 8 years ago were completely gone. You set up an elaborate scheme to test your own wife. I protected myself, I corrected. There's a difference. Lisa stood up from the table, her movement sharp and sudden. The wine glass tipped over, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth, but she didn't seem to notice. She began pacing around the dining room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that reminded me of a predator circling its prey. Protected yourself from what exactly? Her laugh was bitter, unlike any sound I had ever heard from her before. From your loving wife who was trying to help you make smart financial decisions? From someone who was trying to manipulate me into giving her access to money she felt entitled to. She stopped pacing and whirled to face me. Entitled to? Desmond, I am your wife. We are supposed to be partners. Everything you have, everything we build together belongs to both of us. Is that what you really believe? Or is that what you told yourself to justify your behavior? For a moment I thought she might try to maintain the facade, to keep pretending that her motivations had been pure. But something in my tone, or maybe just the futility of continuing the act, made her abandon the pretense entirely. Do you want to know what I really think? She said, crossing her arms and fixing me with a stare that was pure ice. I think you're pathetic. I think you've wasted 8 years of my life pretending to be something you're not. There it was. The real Lisa, the one I had glimpsed in small moments over the years, but had convinced myself I was imagining. What did you think I was pretending to be? Successful, ambitious, someone with actual vision for the future. She gestured around our dining room, at the expensive furniture and artwork we had accumulated during our marriage. When I met you, I thought you were going places. I thought you understood that life is about building something meaningful, about achieving status, about creating wealth. And instead, you're a sentimental fool who clings to the past and wastes opportunities because you're too afraid to take risks. Her voice was getting louder, more venomous. Do you know what our friends say about us, Desmond? Do you know how embarrassing it is to explain why we still live in this modest house while your business brings in enough money to afford something in Westfield Heights? I blinked, genuinely surprised. This house embarrasses you? Everything about our life embarrasses me. Your cheap suits, your practical car, your complete lack of interest in the social connections that could actually advance your career. She was pacing again, gesticulating wildly. I've spent 8 years trying to push you to be better, to want more, to act like someone who deserves respect. And my parents' house was just another example of my failures? Lisa laughed, and the sound was genuinely ugly. Your parents' house was a symbol of everything that's wrong with you, holding on to a worthless piece of property in a declining neighborhood because of sentimental attachment to people who never achieved anything meaningful in their entire lives. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had known Lisa look down on my parents, but hearing her articulate her contempt so clearly, so brutally, made something cold settle in my chest. They were good people, I said quietly. They were losers, she shot back. Your father worked in a factory for 40 years and had nothing to show for it but a mortgage on a house that should have been torn down decades ago. Your mother spent her whole life cooking and cleaning and gardening like it was still 1950. They lived small, meaningless lives, and you were determined to honor that mediocrity. I stood up slowly, my hands steady despite the rage building inside me. Those people loved me unconditionally. They raised me to value loyalty, honesty, and hard work, everything you've proven yourself incapable of. Oh, please, Lisa rolled her eyes. Don't lecture me about loyalty. I've stood by you for 8 years while you consistently refused to live up to your potential. I've pretended to be satisfied with this mediocre life while you wasted opportunity after opportunity. Like what opportunities? Like the Westfield Heights house, like the investment properties I found for us, like the business partnerships I tried to arrange through my social connections. She was practically shouting now. Every single time I found a way for us to advance, to build real wealth, to move in circles that matter, you found some excuse to avoid taking action. Because those weren't investments, Lisa. They were schemes to spend money we didn't have on things we didn't need to impress people who don't actually matter. Don't matter? She stared at me incredulously. Desmond, these are the people who could transform your consulting business. These are the connections that could make us wealthy, really wealthy. But you're too small-minded to understand how the world actually works. I walked over to the window and looked out at our neighborhood. Middle-class houses on tree-lined streets where people lived quiet lives and raised their children and found happiness in simple things. The life my parents had built. The life Lisa found so contemptible. I understand perfectly how the world works, I said. I also understand how you work. When I turned back around, Lisa was standing by the table, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Explain that. You targeted me 8 years ago because you thought I was weak enough to manipulate and successful enough to be worth the effort. You married me because you saw potential for financial gain, not because you loved me. That's ridiculous. Is it? When did you first ask about my parents' house, Lisa? How long after we started dating? She hesitated, and I could see her calculating, trying to remember exactly when she had first brought up the subject. I was concerned about their welfare. That house was clearly too much for them to maintain. You asked about property values on our third date." The words hung in the air between us. I watched her face change as she realized I remembered that conversation, one she probably thought I had forgotten years ago. "You were telling me about your childhood," I continued, "and I mentioned that my parents still lived in the same house where I grew up. You immediately asked what the neighborhood was like, whether property values had gone up, whether they had ever considered selling. That's called making conversation. That's called gathering intelligence, just like you did with everything else about my life. My business income, my investment accounts, my inheritance prospects. You turned courtship into a financial audit." Lisa's composure was cracking completely now. The elegant woman who had greeted me at the door was gone, replaced by someone whose mask had finally slipped entirely. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp and defiant. "You want honesty? I'll give you honesty. Yes, I researched you before we got serious. Yes, I made sure you were financially stable before I committed to a relationship. That's called being smart, Desmond. That's called not wasting my time on men who can't provide the kind of life I deserve." "And what kind of life do you think you deserve?" "Better than this," she gestured around the room with obvious disdain. "I deserve to live somewhere that reflects my taste, my education, my standards. I deserve to travel to places that matter, to socialize with people who have influence, to build something significant instead of just existing. On my money. On our money. Money that you've been too cowardly to leverage properly because you're afraid of taking risks, afraid of appearing ambitious, afraid of admitting that you want more than your parents' pathetic version of the American dream." I pulled out my phone and started recording our conversation. Lisa noticed immediately and laughed. "Are you seriously recording this?" "I'm documenting it. For my attorney." That stopped her short. For the first time since the conversation began, she looked uncertain. "Your attorney? Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for what you did today, Lisa? You hired a demolition crew under false pretenses. You lied to them about having permission to tear down a building. You trespassed on property that doesn't belong to you. You displaced elderly tenants without proper notice. I thought it was our house." "No, you didn't. You knew it was rental property. You knew Robert and Margaret were living there. You just didn't care about destroying their home because you wanted to force my hand." Lisa sank back into her chair, and I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate how much legal trouble she might be in. "What about them?" I asked. "What about Robert and Margaret? Where do you think they're sleeping tonight?" "I don't know. It's not my responsibility." "A 78-year-old man and his wife are homeless tonight because of what you did, and you don't think that's your responsibility." "They're not homeless, Desmond. Don't be so dramatic. They probably went to stay with family or found another rental." "With 24 hours' notice? On their fixed income?" Lisa shrugged, and that gesture told me everything I needed to know about who she really was. "I've been supporting them for 3 months," I said quietly. "What?" "After you demolished what you thought was their home, I moved them into a furnished apartment across town. I'm covering their rent and living expenses until they get back on their feet. Because unlike you, I actually care about the people who get hurt by my decisions." Lisa stared at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like shame cross her face. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "How much?" she asked. "How much what?" "How much are you spending on them? Because that money comes out of our household budget. That's money that should be going toward our future." And there it was. Even faced with the human cost of her actions, her first concern was how it affected her access to money. I looked at my wife of 8 years, this woman I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with, and felt a profound sense of clarity. "Lisa," I said calmly, "I want a divorce." She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't quite process what I had said. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." "Because of this? Because I made one mistake trying to help us move forward financially?" "Because you're not who I thought you were. Because I finally understand that you never loved me, you loved what you thought I could provide. Because you just told me that elderly people losing their home doesn't matter as long as it doesn't cost you money." Lisa's expression shifted again, and suddenly the charm was back. the warmth that had initially attracted me. "Desmond, sweetheart, you're being emotional. We can work through this. Marriage is about forgiveness, about growing together through difficult times." But it was too late. I could see the calculation behind her smile now, the way she was already strategizing how to minimize the damage, how to manipulate her way back to the position she wanted. "The divorce papers will be filed Monday morning," I said. "What about the money, the inheritance?" "What about it?" "I'm entitled to half of everything acquired during our marriage." I smiled for the first time since I had gotten home. "Actually, you're not. Community property laws don't apply to assets I owned before our marriage or inherited separately. The $5 million came from property I inherited from my parents. You have no legal claim to it." Lisa's face went white. "That's not possible." "I've had an excellent attorney for the past 6 months, Lisa, ever since I realized what kind of person I was really married to." She sat there in stunned silence as the full scope of her situation became clear. She had destroyed what she thought was my parents' house to force me to give her access to money she would never see. She had revealed her true nature so completely that there was no possibility of reconciliation, and now she was going to lose everything she had been scheming to get. "You planned this," she whispered. "All of it. The fake house, the hidden money, the recording. You planned to destroy our marriage." "No, Lisa," I said, standing up from the table. "You destroyed our marriage the moment you decided my parents' memory was worth less than your ambitions. I just finally figured out who you really are." As I walked toward the door, she called after me one last time. "Where are you going?" I paused in the doorway and looked back at her, sitting alone at the candle-lit table, surrounded by the evidence of her own greed and manipulation. "To pack my things. You can stay in the house until the divorce is finalized, but I won't be living with you anymore." "Desmond, please, we can fix this." But there was nothing left to fix. The woman I had fallen in love with had never existed. The marriage I thought I was saving had been dead for years. It was time to build something new, something real. I spent that first night at the Hampton Inn downtown, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed while my phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts from Lisa. By morning, I had 47 missed calls and a string of messages that progressed from tearful apologies to angry accusations to increasingly desperate pleas for reconciliation. The last text had arrived at 3:30 in the morning. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. I can destroy you." I forwarded the message to David, my attorney, along with the recording I had made of our conversation the night before. His response came back within minutes. "Don't engage. Document everything. See you at 9. David's office occupied the top floor of one of the oldest buildings in the financial district, with windows that looked out over the river and walls lined with law books that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was one of those lawyers who charged $800 an hour and was worth every penny, especially when dealing with someone like Lisa. "She's going to fight dirty," he said after reviewing the audio recording and the threatening text messages. "People like this don't accept defeat gracefully. She's going to try every angle she can think of to get access to that money." "What kind of angles?" David pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across his mahogany desk. "First, she'll claim the inheritance should be considered community property because you used marital funds to maintain and improve the original property. Second, she'll argue that since you sold the land during your marriage, the proceeds should be split equally. Third, she'll probably try to prove that you defrauded her by hiding assets." I studied the legal briefs he had prepared. "Can she make any of those arguments stick?" "Not if we handle this correctly. The inheritance came from property you owned before the marriage. The improvements you made were minimal and came from your separate business income. The land sale was of an asset you inherited independently. And you didn't defraud her because you were under no legal obligation to disclose the transaction." "What about the demolition? What kind of trouble is she in for that?" David's expression grew more serious. "That's where it gets interesting. She hired a demolition crew under false pretenses, claiming emergency authority she didn't possess. She trespassed on property she doesn't own. She displaced tenants without proper notice, and she did it all with the intent to coerce you into financial decisions. So what are we talking about? Fines? Criminal charges, potentially. Vandalism, fraud, harassment. The district attorney's office takes these kinds of domestic financial crimes very seriously, especially when elderly tenants are involved. My phone rang. Lisa's number. I declined the call and set the phone to silent. She's not going to give up easily, I told David. As if summoned by my words, his assistant knocked on the door and stepped inside with a worried expression. Mr. Patterson, there's a woman downstairs demanding to see you. She says she's Mrs. Holloway and that this is an emergency. David and I exchanged glances. Tell security to escort her out, he said, and call down to the lobby desk. Mrs. Holloway is not to be allowed in this building under any circumstances. After his assistant left, David turned back to me with a grim smile. It's starting. Over the next week, Lisa's campaign to regain control of the situation escalated dramatically. She hired her own attorney, an aggressive divorce specialist named Catherine Moss, who was known for scorched earth tactics in high-asset cases. She filed a temporary restraining order claiming I was hiding community assets. She contacted my business clients suggesting that I was under investigation for financial fraud. But her most devastating move came on Thursday afternoon. I was in a client meeting when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Holloway, there are police officers here. They say they need to speak with you immediately. The two officers who entered my office were professional but serious. Detective Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair, took the lead. Mr. Holloway, we're investigating a complaint of elder abuse and financial exploitation filed by your wife. She alleges that you've been stealing money from elderly tenants and using their Social Security benefits to fund illegal property transactions. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's completely false. We'd like to hear your side of the story, Detective Rodriguez said, pulling out a small recording device. Can you tell us about your relationship with Robert and Margaret Chen? For the next hour, I explained everything: the rental arrangement, the demolition, the temporary housing I had provided for the elderly couple. The detectives took notes, asked pointed questions, and requested documentation for every financial transaction I described. Your wife provided us with bank records showing regular transfers from accounts associated with the Chen family, Detective Martinez said. Can you explain those deposits? I pulled out my phone and called David's office. I need to speak with my attorney before answering any more questions. The investigation lasted 3 days. During that time, Lisa fed the police a carefully crafted narrative that painted me as a predator who had been systematically stealing from vulnerable elderly people while hiding assets from my wife. She provided bank statements that appeared to show suspicious financial activity, witness statements from neighbors who had seen Robert and Margaret looking distressed, and her own tearful testimony about discovering my alleged crimes. What she didn't know was that I had been documenting everything for months. When David and I finally sat down with the detective team on Friday morning, we brought our own evidence: the original rental agreements, receipts for every deposit and expenditure, medical records showing Robert's recent heart surgery that had made them financially vulnerable, and most importantly, video statements from Robert and Margaret themselves. Mrs. Chen, Detective Rodriguez said after watching the elderly woman's recorded testimony, you're saying that Mr. Holloway has never taken money from you illegally? On the laptop screen, Margaret Chen looked directly into the camera with the kind of dignity that comes from surviving 80 years of life's challenges. Mr. Desmond has been nothing but kind to us, she said in her careful English. When his wife destroyed our home, he moved us to a beautiful apartment and told us not to worry about rent until we found work. He brought us groceries, helped us understand the insurance papers, drove me to the hospital when Robert had chest pain. This is a good man. Detective Martinez turned to his notes. And the financial transactions Mrs. Holloway flagged? Those were assistance payments, I explained, After the demolition left them homeless, I've been covering their living expenses. I have receipts for everything: rent, utilities, groceries, medical co-payments. David spread the documentation across the conference table. My client has been supporting the Chens as victims of his wife's criminal destruction of their home. Every penny can be accounted for, and it's all coming from Mr. Holloway's separate inheritance funds. The case against me collapsed within hours. By Friday afternoon, the police were no longer investigating me for elder abuse. Instead, they were building a case against Lisa for filing false reports, obstruction of justice, and the original vandalism charges. But Lisa wasn't finished. When the criminal charges became public record, she shifted tactics again. If she couldn't destroy me legally, she would try to destroy me socially and professionally. The Whisper campaign started over the weekend. Suddenly, people I had known for years were calling to ask if it was true that I was going through a difficult divorce involving financial irregularities. Clients began requesting meetings to discuss the stability of my consulting practice. Business contacts started avoiding me at networking events. Lisa had weaponized our social circle. She told carefully edited versions of our story to mutual friends, painting herself as the innocent wife who had discovered her husband's secret financial dealings and was now being punished for trying to protect elderly people from exploitation. She emphasized the hidden bank accounts, the demolished house, the police investigation, all while omitting the crucial context that would have explained my actions. The most painful blow came from people I had considered close friends. Richard and Susan Morrison, a couple we had socialized with for 5 years, actually confronted me at a charity event. "Desmond, we need to ask you directly," Richard said, pulling me aside near the bar. "Is it true that you've been hiding millions of dollars from Lisa? Because if you're having financial problems, there are better ways to handle it than deceiving your spouse." I looked around the hotel ballroom, where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and business successes together. Half. The people in the room were avoiding eye contact with me. The other half were watching our conversation with obvious curiosity. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Susan ran into Lisa yesterday at the grocery store," Richard continued. "She was crying, said you had threatened to leave her homeless and penniless after 8 years of marriage. That doesn't sound like the man we know." What could I say? That their friend Lisa was a manipulative narcissist who had tried to destroy elderly people's lives to get her hands on money she felt entitled to? That she had been playing a long game of financial manipulation for our entire marriage? That everything they thought they knew about our relationship was based on careful lies? "The divorce will be final soon," I said instead. "I think you'll understand better when all the facts come out." But I could see in Richard's expression that he had already chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. That night I sat alone in my hotel room and took inventory of what Lisa's campaign had cost me. 3 business clients had terminated contracts, 2 long-term friendships were probably over. My reputation in professional circles was damaged, possibly permanently. But as I looked at my phone and saw a text message from Margaret Chen thanking me for helping her husband with his medication schedule, I realized something important. Lisa could take my money, my social status, even my professional reputation. But she couldn't take the one thing that actually mattered: my ability to look at myself in the mirror and know I had done the right thing. The criminal charges against her were moving forward. The divorce proceedings were progressing smoothly despite her attorney's aggressive tactics, and most importantly, I was finally free from the exhausting work of trying to love someone who was incapable of love. Monday morning, I got a call from David with news that would change everything. "The prosecutor wants to offer Lisa a plea deal," he said. 6 months of community service and restitution payments to the Chens in exchange for pleading guilty to vandalism and filing false police reports. What's the alternative? If she goes to trial and loses, she's looking at up to 2 years in prison, plus felony fraud convictions that would destroy any chance of professional employment. I thought about Lisa sitting in her attorney's office, finally understanding that her schemes had real consequences, that there were limits to how much damage she could do before the system fought back. "What do you think she'll do?" David was quiet for a moment. I think she'll take the deal. People like Lisa always take the deal when they're finally cornered. He was right. By Wednesday afternoon, Lisa had accepted the prosecutor's offer. The divorce settlement was finalized the following week. She kept the house and half of our joint savings accounts. I kept my business, my inheritance, and my freedom. But there was still one more surprise waiting for both of us. The final surprise that would define how this story really ended. 1 year later, I stood in the front yard of a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, watching Robert Chen carefully plant tomatoes in the raised garden bed I had built the previous weekend. His movements were slow but determined, and every few minutes he would pause to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool spring morning. "Not too deep," Margaret called from the front porch where she sat shelling peas into a ceramic bowl. "Remember what the man at the garden center said about the roots." Robert waved his hand dismissively but adjusted the depth of his planting anyway. At 81 years old, he had learned to pick his battles with his wife of 57 years. This was their new home, the one I had purchased for them 6 months after the divorce was finalized. Not as a gift, but as an investment in something I had never fully understood before, the kind of wealth that can't be deposited in a bank account. The house cost $230,000, a price that would have seemed modest to Lisa, but felt exactly right to me. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with windows that caught the morning sun, and a yard large enough for Robert's vegetables and Margaret's flower gardens. Most importantly, it was theirs. The deed was in their names, the mortgage was paid in full, and they would never have to worry about anyone taking it away from them. "Mr. Desmond," Margaret called to me, "you stay for lunch? I made too much soup again." I checked my watch. It was Saturday afternoon, I had nowhere else to be, and Margaret's soup was legendary in their new neighborhood. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble." "No trouble," Robert said, brushing dirt from his hands as he stood up slowly. "Margaret always makes food for Army. Better you eat it than I get fat." We had developed this routine over the past year. I would stop by on weekends to help with small projects around the house. Margaret would insist on feeding me, and we would spend hours talking about everything and nothing. They told me stories about their childhoods in China, their immigration to America in the 1970s, their son who lived in California and called every Sunday. I told them about my parents, my work, my plans for the future. What I didn't tell them, what I never told anyone, was that these Saturday afternoons had become the most valuable part of my week. After lunch, as Robert settled into his recliner for his daily nap, and Margaret bustled around the kitchen despite my offers to help clean up, I found myself thinking about how much my life had changed since that phone call in the Chicago hotel room. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago. Lisa kept the house in Westfield Heights, though she had to take out a mortgage to buy out my share of the equity. She also kept half of our joint savings accounts and investment portfolios, which amounted to about $400,000. Her attorney had fought hard to claim a portion of the inheritance, but David's careful documentation proved that the $5 million came entirely from property I had owned before our marriage. Lisa had accepted the criminal plea deal, serving 6 months of community service at a local food bank. The irony of forcing someone who had displaced elderly people to spend her weekends helping the homeless wasn't lost on me, though I took no particular satisfaction in it. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about consequences that match the harm caused. I had also heard through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling financially. The house payments were more than she could afford on her part-time income, and her legal fees had eaten up most of her divorce settlement. She had tried to sell the house twice, but the market had softened and she couldn't get enough to pay off the mortgage and have anything left over. More importantly, her reputation in our former social circle had crumbled once the full story came out. Richard and Susan Morrison, the couple who had confronted me at the charity event, had actually called to apologize 6 months after the divorce. They had learned about the criminal charges, the displaced elderly tenants, and Lisa's systematic manipulation of our marriage. Their apology was sincere, but I found that I didn't need their validation anymore. The business had recovered more quickly than I expected. Word spread that the criminal investigation had cleared me completely, and several clients who had initially distanced themselves came back with larger contracts than before. My reputation for integrity, it turned out, was worth more in the long run than Lisa's social connections had ever been. But the most significant change in my life wasn't financial or professional, it was personal. I had started volunteering at the senior center where Robert and Margaret played cards twice a week. What began as occasional visits to check on their adjustment to the new neighborhood had evolved into regular involvement with the center's programs. I helped elderly residents navigate technology, drove people to medical appointments when family wasn't available, and gradually became part of a community I had never known existed. 3 months ago, the center's director had approached me about joining their board of directors. "We need someone with business experience," Ellen Martinez had explained over coffee in her cluttered office. "Someone who understands finance but also understands what our clients really need." The senior center served about 300 elderly people in the county, providing everything from meal delivery to transportation to social activities. Their budget was always tight, their facilities were outdated, and their staff was overworked and underpaid. But the people they served reminded me why money was supposed to matter. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, the 85-year-old widow who came to the center every day because it was the only place she could afford to eat lunch and have a conversation with another human being. I thought about Harold Kim, the 90-year-old veteran who had built a successful landscaping business after the war but now lived on Social Security because medical bills had consumed his life savings. These were people who had worked hard, raised families, contributed to their communities, and deserved better than to spend their final years isolated and struggling. I accepted the board position, and by Christmas, I had convinced the other directors to let me fund a major expansion. The new Margaret and Robert Chen Community Wing opened last month. It includes a commercial kitchen where volunteers prepare meals for home delivery, a health clinic staffed by nurses who specialize in geriatric care, and a computer lab where seniors can video chat with distant family members or learn to navigate online banking. The dedication ceremony was small but meaningful. About 50 people gathered in the main hall while Ellen Martinez gave a speech about the importance of community support for vulnerable seniors. Robert cut the ribbon with shaking hands while Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Why you name it for us?" Margaret had asked me when I first proposed the idea. "We just ordinary people." "No," I had told her. "You're extraordinary people who happen to live ordinary lives. That's exactly who this place should honor." Standing in their garden now, watching Robert methodically water his tomato plants while Margaret swept the front porch, I understood something about happiness that I had never grasped during my marriage to Lisa. Happiness isn't about accumulating enough wealth to impress other people. It's about having enough resources to take care of the people you love and enough purpose to make your life meaningful. The $5 million that Lisa had been so desperate to control was still sitting in investment accounts, growing steadily and providing me with more financial security than I would ever need. But the money that felt most valuable was the much smaller amount I spent each month supporting the senior center, helping families like the Chens, and building the kind of community my parents would have been proud to be part of. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David's number appeared on the screen. "I have news," he said when I answered. "Lisa's filed for bankruptcy." I felt something that might have been sadness, but not for the reason I expected. What happened? She couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments on the house. Also, apparently she borrowed money against her car to pay for credit card debt, and that's caught up with her. She's losing everything. I walked to the other side of Robert's garden, lowering my voice so the elderly couple wouldn't overhear. "Is she asking for help?" "No, actually, she's trying to get the criminal. Restitution payments reduced because of financial hardship. Claims she can't afford the monthly payments to the Chens." The restitution was only $200 a month. Money that was supposed to help cover the additional living expenses Robert and Margaret had incurred because of the demolition. It was a token amount compared to what Lisa had actually cost them, but it was the principle that mattered. What do you think will happen? The court probably won't modify the order. Criminal restitution isn't dischargeable in bankruptcy, and $200 a month isn't considered unreasonable for someone who's physically capable of working. After David hung up, I stood in the Chen's garden for a long time, thinking about the choices that had led Lisa and me to such different places. I had married her, thinking she was ambitious, sophisticated, someone who would push me to achieve more than I might accomplish alone. What I had failed to understand was the difference between ambition and greed, between wanting to build something meaningful and simply wanting to acquire things that would impress other people. Lisa's version of success was about status symbols. Expensive houses, luxury cars, designer clothes, social connections that could be leveraged for more opportunities to acquire more status symbols. It was a circular pursuit that never led to satisfaction, because there was always someone with a bigger house, a newer car, more exclusive connections. My parents' version of success was about relationships. Marriage that deepened with time, children who grew up feeling loved and secure, neighbors who became family, work that provided dignity and purpose. They had died in the same modest house where they had raised me, surrounded by photographs of people who loved them, leaving behind a legacy of kindness that was still paying dividends in my life. "Mr. Desmond," Margaret called from the porch, "you look too serious for Saturday afternoon. Come sit. Robert wake up soon and want to show you his pepper plants." I joined her on the porch steps, accepting the glass of iced tea she pressed into my hands. The afternoon sun slanted across their small front yard, illuminating the flower borders Margaret had planted around Robert's vegetable garden. Their mailbox, which I had helped Robert install last month, bore their name in neat black letters, Chen. This was what wealth looked like when it was used properly. Not to buy things, but to buy security. Not to impress strangers, but to take care of people who mattered. Not to accumulate assets, but to build relationships that would outlast any bank account. "Margaret," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about the house on Maple Street? Do you miss it?" She was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in the wooden chair Robert had bought at a garage sale and painted white to match their front door. "I miss the neighbors," she said finally. "Mrs. Patterson next door, she give me tomatoes from her garden every summer. Tom Morrison across street, he helped Robert fix car when it no start. That neighborhood, it was family." "Do you ever wish none of this had happened? That Lisa hadn't demolished the house?" Margaret stopped rocking and looked at me with the kind of clear-eyed wisdom that comes from surviving 8 decades of life's unexpected turns. "Mr. Desmond, you know what I learned in 82 years. Bad things happen, but good people make good things from bad things. Your wife, she tried to hurt us, yes, but you make sure we okay. Now we have beautiful house, nice neighborhood, no worry about rent. Sometimes God used bad people to bring good people together." As if summoned by her words, Robert appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up at odd angles from his nap. "Pepper plants ready for tour," he announced seriously. "Very important peppers this year. Margaret say they're going to be too hot, but I know what I'm doing." I spent the next hour examining Robert's carefully tended pepper plants while he explained his theories about soil preparation and optimal spacing. Margaret brought out a plate of homemade cookies and listened to his lecture with the patience of someone who had heard similar presentations for 57 years, but still found them endearing. When it was time to leave, they walked me to my car like they did every Saturday. Robert shook my hand formally while Margaret hugged me and pressed a container of leftover soup into my hands. "You drive careful," she said, the same words she used every week. "I will. See you next Saturday." "We be here," Robert said, and I knew they would be. As I drove home through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood, past houses where families were finishing weekend dinners and children were playing in front yards, I thought about the letter I had received from Lisa's attorney the previous week. She was requesting a meeting to discuss what her lawyer called potential reconciliation discussions. Reading between the lines of legal language, she wanted to know if I would be interested in giving our marriage another chance. I had asked David, to respond with a polite but firm refusal. Some mistakes can be forgiven. Some relationships can be repaired with time, effort, and genuine commitment to change. But what Lisa and I had shared hadn't been a real marriage. It had been a performance, an elaborate fiction where I played the role of successful husband while she played the role of devoted wife. Both of us pretending that what we felt for each other was love instead of convenience. Real love wasn't what I had felt for Lisa during our 8 years together. Real love was what I saw between Robert and Margaret, two people who had built a life based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Real love was what my parents had shared, the kind of partnership where each person's happiness was genuinely important to the other, where decisions were made based on what was good for both people instead of what benefited one person at the other's expense. That evening, I sat in my own modest apartment and reviewed the plans Ellen Martinez had sent me for the senior center's next expansion. With careful investment of another portion of my inheritance, we could add a small medical clinic and a transportation service for seniors who could no longer drive. It would cost about $800,000, money that Lisa would have considered wasted on people who couldn't provide anything in return. But I had learned something important over the past year. The best investments are the ones that pay dividends in satisfaction rather than dollars. As I signed the authorization forms and prepared to wire the funds, I thought about my parents and what they would think of how I had used their legacy. Dad, who had worked double shifts to pay off a modest mortgage, and Mom, who had saved every penny so they could leave me something valuable when they were gone. They had given me more than money. They had given me an example of how to live with dignity, how to value the right things, how to build wealth that mattered. And finally, at 55 years old, I was beginning to understand what they had been trying to teach me all along. The real inheritance wasn't the $5 million, it was the knowledge of how to use it.